China has and still is imposing some of the most restrictive and inhumane lockdowns in the world. Citizens have been forced to stay inside of their homes and not allowed to leave under any circumstances, even if they are in need of food and medicine. Those who are sick with COVID are refused any attention, with even emergency access to hospitals being limited. Even commercial food deliveries were halted, and the government took the reins on distributing food. These restrictions are so extreme that as of April 2022, when the Western world, well, minus Canada, has declared that COVID is no longer an Avengers-level threat, China actually has more factories closed down than at any other point during the pandemic. Over the course of this video, we're going to see if these draconian and nonsensical Chinese Communist Party policies will affect the international market and supply chains, potentially accelerating the likelihood of a full-fledged recession. If you want to keep up to date with the world of trucking, don't forget to subscribe and let's get into it. There is no sign that Shanghai, which can be thought of as the Chinese equivalent to New York City, will be easing lockdowns anytime soon. Footage on social media can be found showing steel fences being installed on public roads and inside residential compounds to keep people from traveling to other districts and moving within their own neighborhoods. The CCP, it would seem, is attempting to build the world's largest prison or a life-size model of the Hunger Game districts while trying to become successful in their lofty COVID-0 policy. After the CCP failed to reopen the cities for mid-May as originally stated, they then said by June 1st they will reopen. However, as I write this in the second week of June, there's been little movement on that front. Now, as for what the CCP's intentions and motivations behind these restrictions are, that's uncertain. And many of us in the Western world are watching with horror as innocent citizens are being subjected to these tyrannical policies. However, we too may not just feel the ripple effects, but full-fledged waves from this COVID-0 policy. Seeing as the nations of the world have become increasingly dependent on China with the globalization of supply chains and manufacturing, these lockdowns are highly likely to have a dramatic effect on domestic freight markets as well as the overall economy. Around April, when factory closures in China were at an all-time high, shippers started holding the price power, as softening freight conditions walked hand in hand with the slowdown of manufacturing by China. According to FreightWaves, the slowdown is about to hit US ports and the trucking companies that service them in a much more dramatic way. They've estimated that container imports from China represent roughly 16% of US truckload volumes and an even larger percentage of domestic dry van truckloads. The fact that nearly half of the containers that come into the United States originate in China is not something that can be overlooked. With the three largest cities in China being essentially removed from the world market, analysts estimate at least 40% of China's GDP has been taken offline. The vast majority of this GDP is directly related to global manufacturing, so by removing that manufacturing, they've essentially thrown a wrench in the flow of containers from the world economy. Container volumes from China to America started to fall on April 6th. However, it hasn't been a straight path downhill, much more like a roller coaster. In less than 2 weeks, container volumes dropped by 31%, but in the following weeks they rebounded to about 16%. And there have been continuous cycles of these ups and downs ever since. While Chinese ports are operating, the bigger risk is with Chinese trucking operations. According to a report by Bloomberg, only 20% of Shanghai's trucking capacity has been in use during these lockdowns, seeing as they aren't allowed to enter or leave the largest cities in the nation. Trucking is an even larger piece of the puzzle when it comes to the flow of containers in and out of the Chinese ports than it is for the Americans. Over 75% of containers from Chinese ports either enter or exit by a truck. However, America is much more diverse in its methods by supplementing trucking with the use of railroads, something China lacks in its infrastructure when compared to the US. Seeing as China's truckload capacity has been throttled, that means raw materials and components can't get from the ports to these factories, and in turn, finished goods can't leave the factories to be put on ships for export. These very temporary blips of increased freight that we've seen during China's lockdowns are suspected to be containers that were already in queue prior to the lockdowns and have just now been finding their way to the ports, not newly manufactured goods that would be a sign of rising economic stability. This is most likely going to create a domino effect. If factories can't receive new components and raw materials, they will eventually stop operating once their supplies are exhausted, even if the lockdowns are lifted. We're seeing the flaws of globalization in real time. When the world relies so heavily on one country for production, our economies are at the whim of a foreign, and in this case, hostile government, seeing as the US and China's relations are deteriorating by the day. Without manufacturing at home to pick up the slack, there will be a period of massive inflation due to choked supply, And I'm sorry to say, the inflation we're experiencing at the present moment is really just a preview of what's to come if these issues aren't sorted. Seeing as America, Russia, and China seem to be preparing for a potential hot war, I really don't see them sitting down at a table anytime soon to discuss how to better economies for us common folk. Our international supply chains involve large webs of suppliers that are interconnected, and just because one supplier is online doesn't mean that other suppliers are, and once they shut down, it will take much longer to bring them up to full productivity. Also, as economic situations worsen in China, there is a delay as to when we feel them on the other side of the pond. According to Sonar's Ocean Intelligence dashboard, it currently takes 27 days for a vessel to travel from a Chinese port to an American one. After a cargo ship docks, it takes anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks for containers to enter the domestic freight market. Eventually, all of the pent-up orders will be shipped. As for when that will happen, no one knows. If the process for ramping up shipping volumes happens quickly, then American ports could expect to experience deja vu of last year's shipping influx and backlog. However, if this is delayed further, it could erode the entire global supply chain forecasts and product orchestration. Goods and freight aside, if American manufacturers can't get parts and components from China that they need, we could see many of these domestic manufacturers have to halt production as well, which would have long-lasting impacts, maybe even for decades to come. Supply chain professionals are already starting to table alternatives to China. These conditions are proving why that's so important. According to FreightWaves, they are seeing a surge in requests from supply chain organizations that want to move production closer to home. And cost, which is a major issue at play here, is only one consideration when choosing a production site. Dependability is often far more important. A lot of people for decades have been saying that North American large-scale manufacturing will never resume due to the costs, but boardrooms are now prioritizing supply chains in ways that they never have before. After all, expensive products are better than no products at all. So all of this taken into consideration, are we headed into a full-fledged recession? Well, any hope of cooling the prices of goods seems highly unlikely when this situation will undoubtedly cause a burst of upward pressure on prices. According to one of the Bank of America's lead economists, the severity of this issue should become apparent in government data expected to be released this month. In a FreightWaves interview, this economist mentioned, quote, "The China lockdowns are yet another headache for the Fed in its fight against inflation." Another Bank of America analyst was self-described as more pessimistic about the economy as many key indicators continue to hint at more persistent inflation. According to both the Bank of America and Goldman Sachs, the odds of a recession in the next year are in the mid-30% range. However, the NASDAQ stock market, which is very tech-heavy, has tumbled nearly 29% this year, while the S&P 500, which is widely regarded as the best indicator of American equities, is down 20%. According to economist Mark Zandi, he puts the odds of a recession at nearly 50% within the next 24 months. When these lockdowns will be ended and supply chains will begin to operate again is a guessing game. However, every worst-case estimate going back 3 months has been proven to be the case. While there are more than enough negatives to harp about in regards to the current economic situation, I think the one positive is that this will illuminate the glaring flaws in globalism, and countries like Canada and America, under the right leadership, could start pivoting back to a do-things-at-home approach. Even if that is the case, it won't happen overnight, and not every industry will shift back. But it's most definitely starting to be looked at as not just a good business idea, but rather a matter of national security to resume production at home. And the CCP's lockdowns are only accelerating this movement. As for freight markets in specific, watching the daily market conditions will be critical to fleet operators in their search for a head haul market, which means a freight market in which there are more loads than dispatchable trucks, which would put the pricing power back in the hands of drivers and fleet operators alike. Well, that's all from me, folks. We'd love to hear what you think. Are we headed into a recession? If so, what steps are you taking to ensure your economic survival? Let us know in the comments below, and if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with new content, and we'll catch you next time.